Those who know me know that when it comes to games, I don't discriminate. There are very few things that will turn me away from a game before I play it. However, even though I won't reject a game outright for its style or content, I do have different expectations for different types of games. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about a game that surprised me, a game that I did not expect to enjoy nearly as much as I have. That game is Evenicle, and I apologize for probably butchering the pronunciation there. Evenicle is a JRPG developed by Alicesoft. It's also an eroge. Eroge are video games that are pornographic in nature. Adult games have a pretty bad reputation, and if we're being honest, it's not entirely undeserved. If you decide to journey into the world of NSFW gaming, you're gonna have to wade through a lot of really terrible games that are clearly only meant to be played 10 minutes at a time, if you know what I mean. However, every so often, you'll actually find something good. I've been playing through Evenicle recently, and what keeps me playing is not the sex, but the game and its story. I think Evenicle is an example of adult gaming done right. It's actually a good game. So I'd like to go through what it does right and what it does wrong. But before I go into detail, let me give you a brief rundown of the game and its story. Evenicle takes place in a world where society lives under two divine rules. You may not kill another human being, and you may not have sex with more than one partner. Break either rule and you become an outlaw, where nothing you create or cultivate can live. You can't grow crops, you can't raise animals, and you're an outcast from society. The only exceptions to these rules are soldiers, who have the ability to kill outlaws without repercussions, and knights, who can kill and can have multiple partners in order to pass on their strong genes. The higher ranking the knight, the more partners they can have. You play as Aster, a young man raised on an island in the middle of nowhere. Basically, he's really horny and wants to become a knight so he can marry the two women who raised him. Along the way, he gets caught up in an epic struggle for the fate of the world itself. If that sounds really stupid, that's because it is. But it works. Trust me, I'll get into it more later in the video. The gameplay is not unlike other JRPGs with multi-unit turn-based combat. Units with higher speed move first, and there are a wide array of abilities and attacks to use. Again, I'll go into more detail later, but I just wanted to explain that much so you have a baseline understanding of the game. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, let's dissect this game piece by piece. First off, let's discuss the characters themselves. As this is a harem game, a large part of the storytelling hinges on the interactions between its cast of characters. Many games that feature a cast of characters fall into the trap of making each character a trope, effectively having only a single defining personality trait while otherwise being completely one-dimensional. Admittedly, the characters in Evenicle are somewhat caricatured and do each have a defining personality trait, however, they are all more complex than they first appear. A good example of this is Ramius, who is the first one to join the party aside from Aster himself. She's the competitive, bullheaded one. However, as the game progresses and more interactions are revealed to the player, it becomes clear that she suffers from an inferiority complex that directly clashes with her desire to improve herself. No matter how much she accomplishes, she never feels as if she deserves any kindness, and as a result she pushes herself even harder while simultaneously pushing people away. As you learn more about her, the layers peel away and she goes from being that stereotypical trope of a warrior woman to actually being relatable and sympathetic. And it's not just her. Every single character has these underlying flaws and insecurities that are constantly being revealed to the player, giving the characters a much more human presentation than in similar games. How do these characters get fleshed out, you ask? That's an excellent question, hypothetical viewer. The game will basically drip-feed the side plots to you. The main story will obviously give you some character development since the characters do exist as a part of the story, but many of the interactions and deeper parts of the characters' personalities are revealed piece by piece. There are two main types of collectibles scattered throughout the world: landmarks and flirt events. The landmarks are mostly there to give more background on the world and its history. The flirt events are marked by a big pink heart in the world and will contain a little snippet about one of the other party members, all of whom become Aster's wives at some point. Sorry if you consider that a spoiler, but it should be pretty obvious. The game doesn't exactly hide the fact that just about every attractive female character in the game will end up with Aster at some point. These events can almost be considered a bonding moment between Aster and the wife in question. For example, one of these events focuses on Kath, the reclusive genius character. Her previous events were mostly focused on her inability to express her feelings and her difficulty in getting close to people. However, in this event, she's depressed. It turns out she suffers from severe mood swings, and when she's down, she's miserable and thinks of herself as worthless. It's when she's at rock bottom that she's willing to actually admit her feelings and show that she really does care and that she really is grateful that someone was willing to show her unconditional love. The first time she could truly be honest was when she was at her lowest. I felt my heart breaking a bit during that scene, and that's a good thing. The game is absolutely littered with these events, but you won't just be experiencing one after the other. You'll have to explore a bit and progress through the main story to find each one, so you won't just get a massive info dump of character development. Each of these scenes is important, and they stand out because you're not seeing them all at once. It's a small thing, but it goes a long way towards making these characters more relatable and more sympathetic. A lot more character development happens during love events, which are intentionally time-gated. From what I can tell, participating in any battle will raise the love gauge in the bottom right a small amount. Once it's full, you can go back to Aster's home and choose a wife to have an extended cutscene with. This will focus on Aster and that character, their bond, and the personality that defines them. Sometimes there will be an adult scene included, but not always. This is where you really get to see how the character thinks and feels because you get them in a one-on-one setting rather than being with the entire group. Their personality isn't masked or diluted by the other characters, and you get to understand them just a bit more. The game also does a good job encouraging the player to experience these events because you get a reward each time you view one. This can be a skill point, a useful item that can't be obtained elsewhere, or even an additional item slot for that character, which is extremely useful. The rewards are good enough that it's worth pursuing these events even if you're not particularly interested in the story. This is a good thing because a lot of times, players of any type of game won't actually make the best choices for the most fulfilling playthrough. Developers will oftentimes have to actively encourage the type of playstyle that'll result in the best experience overall. A good example of this is Darkest Dungeon, which constantly autosaves your progress. This prevents save scumming and makes the permadeath system actually important, which forces players to treat each decision carefully and play through their mistakes. But that's a topic for another video. Evenicle actively makes the player want to experience the side stories and characters, even if it's initially only to get the reward at the end. It helps the player enjoy the story just a little bit more now that they understand the character better, even if they don't realize it at first. And I can't talk about the characters without mentioning our hero Aster. His defining character trait is that he's constantly horny and has absolutely no filter, which is often played up for laughs. However, if that was the only thing about him, it would be tough to sympathize with him. In addition to his overactive sex drive, he has a kind heart, a strong moral compass, and a childlike impulse control outside of combat. These types of personality traits are pretty common for the protagonists of a lot of books, movies, and games. That's because noble characteristics give the audience a positive view of the character on a more objective level, while humbling characteristics serve to ground the character and make them much more relatable on a subjective level. Together, this creates a character that can be looked up to while not placing them on such a pedestal as to be out of reach. The reason this is so common is because this kind of character is actually a lot easier to write than many others, and it works. What I'm trying to get at is that Aster is very likable and relatable, and even though I feel like he has the least overall personal development of all the significant characters, he's an effective protagonist and I enjoyed my time in his shoes. Okay, moving on from the characters, I have to address the elephant in the room and how it affects the game as a whole. Evenicle is an eroge. There's sex. A lot of it. That's just the nature of games like this. The sex scenes themselves are pretty graphic, both in the artwork and the writing. For obvious reasons, I can't exactly show anything in this video, but trust me when I say that the writers go into great detail with each scene. The tone of these scenes varies greatly, with some being passionate, others humorous, and still others being straight up disturbing. However, one commonality is that they all receive heavy focus. None of them are glossed over, and none of them are short. It's clear to me that the developers were partially pandering to the crowd who are only really interested in the adult content rather than the game itself. That's not inherently a problem, though at times it can be immersion-breaking when the tone of the game shifts abruptly from the story at hand to messy sex scene. But one thing I will say about the raunchy nature of the game is that despite having a relatively serious story and characters, it's very self-aware and unapologetic at how ridiculous it can be. Despite some very serious subject matter at times, Evenicle has a lighthearted and humorous tone. There are some ludicrous setups for the various sex scenes, such as Ramius getting her hair stuck in Aster's fly after an accidental collision, rendering her entirely unable to get up off his face. I was rolling my eyes a bit, but then a bystander shouted out that he's so happy to have finally witnessed an accidental sexual encounter in real life and now can die happy. Evenicle knows what it's doing and it won't hesitate to play it for a laugh. It's actually kind of refreshing to see a game have a real story to tell while also acknowledging the eroge tropes that it's voluntarily taking part in. Could they have been more tasteful with the sexual content? Absolutely. However, I think Evenicle goes a long way into showing that you can have extremely lewd and absurd sex scenes without damaging the story as a whole. Now, though I do think the sexual content is handled well overall, there are a few issues I have that I do need to mention. The first is relatively minor. Since Evenicle is a Japanese eroge, there's more than a little bit of fetish pandering. Many of the sex scenes are geared towards a particular fetish, and they did their best to be really inclusive. There's bondage, different body parts changing sizes, heavy involvement with every bodily fluid in existence, tentacles, because of course there are, voyeurism, mind-breaking, gender-bending, and many more besides. It can be a little off-putting when there's a sex scene centered on a fetish that you're not personally into. And the sex scenes are pretty long, so you're gonna be stuck there for a good few minutes unless you just skip through the whole thing. Overall, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it did negatively impact my experience a few times. The other issue I have is a little more serious. Throughout the game, there are several scenes depicting sexual violence. Before I go any further, let me be very clear. My problem is not the fact that the story of Evenicle has sexual violence, or even that it's shown. In fact, I think a lot of media would do well to embrace the twisted and depraved elements of humanity and explore the stories that can emerge from an examination of the worst evils the world has to offer. What I have a problem with is how these scenes are handled. As I mentioned earlier, all the sex scenes in Evenicle are fairly long and very graphic. Basically, they're written like they expect you to jerk off to them. This includes the multiple gang rape scenes and more than one scene that end with the victim being eaten alive by the attacker. These scenes are meant to be horrifying and sickening. I respect the devs for having the guts to show the extreme darkness that humanity is capable of, but it's jarring when these scenes continue to play out past the point where the depravity has already been demonstrated sufficiently for the story. Again, it's like they expect me to enjoy these scenes. They're written in the same style as the happier sex scenes, and that made me uncomfortable for all the wrong reasons. It's not like narratively they're trying to portray these scenes in a positive light, but it rubs me the wrong way when they take a character that you've developed an emotional attachment to, have her be brutally violated, and then act like you're supposed to enjoy it. I think their commitment to having these long and graphic sex scenes does them a disservice when it starts getting disgusting and evil. It actually gets to the point where if you're sensitive to this type of content, if depictions of sexual violence truly disturb you, it's probably better to pass on Evenicle, even though these scenes are a minority. They really don't hold back, and I could see it being distressing to some people. Okay, because I don't want to end this section on such a negative note, here's something that's pretty funny. In a few of the sex scenes, one detail is just wrong. Okay, how can I put this delicately? The butthole's in the wrong spot. Sometimes, instead of being in its proper location, it's moved up a few inches to almost line up with the tailbone. It's kinda hilarious because I don't even know how you can get that wrong. What makes it even more baffling is it's not even a constant error. Some CGs will get it right while others completely mess it up. It's not the worst thing, and I don't think it's very harmful to the game as a whole, but it can be immersion breaking when I'm laughing at the incorrect proportions rather than experiencing the story. I can't exactly show you any examples, but trust me, it's hilarious. I know I've already talked your ear off without even touching gameplay, but hey, I'm a story guy. I like lore and discovering the worlds I play in, and I'm not going to apologize for that. To me, the story of the game is a lot of times just as important as the gameplay. So with that, let's actually get into the gameplay, because I think it does a few neat things. I'm not the biggest fan of JRPGs. I can enjoy them here and there, but as a genre, I don't really like them enough to seek them out. I think that's because in my viewpoint, JRPG devs tend to cater their games to people who are already into JRPGs rather than someone who might not be as familiar. But I did like Evenicle a lot. Interestingly, it's not very different from your standard JRPG at its core, but it made a lot of little decisions to help alleviate some of the problems that I personally have with JRPGs. But before I go too deep into that, let's talk about how the general gameplay between story sections plays out. When you're traveling the world, either exploring or heading to your next objective, this progress bar in the top left will fill up. If you're on a road, it'll fill significantly slower. Once it fills completely, you have a high chance to enter battle. Once you complete a battle or enter a new area, the bar fully depletes. I don't know if other games do anything similar, but all the JRPGs I've played have featured fully random encounters. I like Evenicle's system because it's really nice to be able to gauge when your next encounter will be, at least roughly. It's just a nice overall quality of life upgrade. What I feel sets Evenicle apart from other JRPGs are the little things, such as the aforementioned progress bar for enemy encounters. Individually, these changes don't do much, but together it makes Evenicle feel unique, even if it's still a JRPG at heart. The combat follows standard JRPG format. Each unit will attack in a turn-based fashion, with the speed stat determining how early and how frequently attacks are made. You can see the move order towards the left side of your screen. Each unit has a simple attack and a variety of abilities to use in battle, with different units having different abilities. Each character has a certain amount of skill points. Leveling up and completing certain events can increase this number. In order to equip a skill, you must spend a certain number of skill points. As long as the skill is equipped, it can be freely used. One nice feature is that you can actually unequip skills to regain the skill points at no penalty. You only have to be out of combat. This allows you to customize your team on the fly and adapt to different environments much more effectively. A good example of when I used this was during one of the later boss fights. I'm not going to say who it was because it's actually pretty important to the story. This boss has a mechanic where every time he attacks, he becomes enraged, causing future attacks to deal significantly more damage. What I did to deal with this was to unequip Aster's Neo Strong attack, which basically just deals extra damage, and equipped Soothe Strike. Soothe Strike removes the target's enraged status while otherwise being just a standard attack. Not very many enemies use the enraged mechanic, so it's usually not worth the skill point investment, but for that specific fight, it was borderline mandatory. Other games with more restrictive systems can fall into the trap where you know what strategy will overcome your current obstacle, but you're unable to pull it off due to how you invested your skill points beforehand. Now, I'm not saying restrictive systems are always bad, but they can definitely lead to balancing difficulties if the developers don't anticipate certain playstyles. I'd also like to mention the Battle Point, or BP system. This is not entirely unique to the game, as I've seen other games use similar systems, but it's a lot less common than the more traditional mana systems. In Evenicle, most skills and abilities, aside from a basic attack, cost BP. At the start of your turn, each character will gain 1 BP up to a maximum of 5. I personally like this system a lot because it allows for abilities to be continually used throughout combat, and it makes the timing of these skills much more important. In other JRPGs, I find that unless a specific enemy mechanic requires specific counters, a lot of fights end up with a player using all of their powerful spells and abilities up front without really putting much thought into it, aside from maybe a standard rotation that's done every single fight. In Evenicle, you can save up your powerful abilities to try to combo for massive damage, but if you hold up too long, you'll waste the BP regeneration, which severely limits your overall combat effectiveness. It adds another level of depth to the combat, and there are usually several ways to approach each enemy. It also has one other positive that may or may not have been intentional. In many JRPGs, the mage character gets relegated into basically being a heal bot. Their mana pool acts more or less like a second health pool for their team, and they're not really useful for much else. Well, in Evenicle, the mage Riche, sorry again for probably butchering the pronunciation there, simply can't be just a heal bot because the BP system won't allow it. Her healing abilities each cost between 4 and 5 BP, meaning you can't cast 2 heals in a row under any circumstances without using consumables, which are both rare and expensive. Plus, a lot of times, the combat encounters are short enough that you won't take enough turns to regenerate the BP from a single heal. In these cases, you're better off not even using a heal, and instead you should use offensive magic to take out a dangerous target. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention that unlike other JRPG mages who tend to be purely supports, Riche has arguably the highest immediate damage output of everyone? Riche's offensive abilities almost all scale multiplicatively off of her magic stat, which goes up pretty significantly as she levels up and upgrades her gear. Additionally, most enemies will have elemental weaknesses, which Riche can easily exploit by casting different types of spells. Combine this with the fact that she has a ton of multi-target abilities, and she becomes a force to be reckoned with. This particularly makes boss fights a lot more strategic. Do you conserve her BP so she can heal the party a few times, or do you cast spells to try to out-damage the boss? I personally found it really satisfying to test out different approaches to different fights rather than just having Riche heal the most wounded party member every turn. And one more thing I'd really like to mention is the overall pacing of Evenicle. JRPGs have a tendency to be really grindy. It's pretty commonplace for JRPG players to grind out random mobs for experience points or money, and that's something I really don't enjoy most of the time. I don't like being underleveled for every major combat. It ends up feeling like an arbitrary barrier to progress. This also clashes with another commonality of JRPGs, which is the fact that you're encouraged to run from most encounters. So you're simultaneously constantly in need of levels, but also discouraged from actually fighting the enemies you come across, which will give you those levels, because you generally lose more health by fighting than running. Evenicle combats this issue by making it so running is only an option for Aster, not anyone else. Furthermore, running will actually cost 1 BP, so your BP won't ever recharge to full, whether you succeed or not. Plus, Aster basically skips his turn if he fails, and he's a big source of damage, so that can be very devastating. As I mentioned before, sometimes developers have to basically force players into certain behavior to increase their overall enjoyment of the game. In this case, they made running more annoying than fighting while keeping it as an option for if you're about to die. This inevitably results in more leveling by the player on the way to each objective. Alright, so remember way back in the beginning of the video when I mentioned the Landmark and Flirt event collectibles? Well, that and the occasional side quest do a great job of encouraging exploration, which naturally leads to more combat as you're running around and filling up your encounter bar more. During my playthrough, I never went out of my way to grind for XP or money unless I was only a tiny bit off of a level or item. I also never really felt like I was under-leveled or under-geared. The only exception to this would be maybe the final boss fight, but then I went around and searched for my missing collectibles, and then I was fine. Overall, the game progressed at a good rate, and while the bosses were consistently challenging, I never felt trapped and in need of grinding in order to progress. Admittedly, I'm a bit of a completionist, so I may have done more exploring than the average player, but even so, I don't think a little less running around would have made the game much more difficult. The last big thing I'd like to talk about is how equipment upgrades work. As you might imagine, you can purchase better gear, and you can find gear from chests and as random loot. This is pretty standard for JRPGs, but Evenicle does it a little differently. When opening chests or looting enemies, you can only get the same types of gear that you already have equipped, but in +1, +2, and rarely +3 variants. These will offer minor stat bonuses over the base versions of the gear. However, if you actually want a serious upgrade, you'll have to buy it from a shop, with better items being available the further you progress through the story. And of course, you'll unlock the plus variants of your new gear by doing so. This is nice because it allows you to get upgrades from exploration and combat while not allowing you to rely on this for all your progression, so you can basically ignore money. And in terms of overall progression, I found that whenever I had spent a decent amount of time since my last shopping trip, I'd have a nice stockpile of gold and items I could sell for gold. I'd usually be able to buy at least 1 or 2 new weapons or armor, and I usually wouldn't be able to buy out the entire shop. A lot of times I'd actually make it to the next shop without having purchased all the available upgrades in the previous one. It felt pretty good. There are a lot of other little things the game does that I really liked, but I'm not going to go over them all. Quite frankly, this video is already obnoxiously long as is. The point I'm trying to make is that Evenicle is an example of a great adult game because ultimately it's a good game first. That doesn't mean that it ignores or downplays its raunchier side, but it doesn't let the adults-only aspects harm the underlying game. When I was playing through Evenicle, I wanted to keep playing primarily because I enjoyed the game. The sexy anime ladies were honestly secondary. Good adult games certainly exist, but they're few and far between. I think it would be great if more games would follow Evenicle's example of being a good game that just so happens to have adult content, rather than being adult content that technically has gameplay. Thanks for watching. I know it goes without saying, but if you liked the video, likes, comments, subscriptions would all please the almighty algorithm. Also, please let me know if you liked this longer style of video. Well, once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Can you make my world